Our Prime Minister was absolutely right when he condemned the Hamas attack on Israel as a terrorist act. By definition, any unlawful violent act or intimidation by anyone, be it a state, an organization, or even an individual, if that action is specially directed against civilians in the pursuit of political objectives, then it's a terrorist act. Hamas wants to liberate Palestinians from the stranglehold of Israel, and to achieve that goal, it resorted to wanton violence last Saturday. It was a clear terrorist act, and our Prime Minister was right in condemning it. But the question arises, why our Prime Minister's lips were sealed when Benjamin Netanyahu and his band of gangsters had launched repeated attacks against the civilian population in both West Bank and Gaza Strip, just to consolidate the Jewish control over the Arab territory? The death and destruction that those raids have caused in the Palestinian homeland are clearly terrorist acts. But look at our government's tame response to terrorists, such as Netanyahu and company. Either our government was silent, or it said that the Israeli attack on Palestinians was an internal matter we are not concerned with. This is the double face of our government. Look at the statement of Saudi Arabia, which is closely linked to the US and to India, and which is now inching closer to even Israel. It has issued a balanced statement in response to the current Hamas strike. This is a statement that a self-proclaimed Vishwaguru like India should take a lesson from. What did Saudi Arabia say? It said that it was concerned about the unfortunate attack on Israeli civilians, but it also raised the issue of the two-state solution in West Asia, the denial of which by Netanyahu has led to simmering discontent among Palestinians. But what did India do? Of course, there can be no justification of violence by Hamas to give expression to the Palestinian discontent. Just as there can be no justification of violence by the likes of Netanyahu to keep the Palestinians subjugated forever. There is a moral equivalence there. It's our duty to condemn in unequivocal terms whenever anyone indulges in a terrorist act. We must not distinguish whether they are the killers employed by a terrorist group like Hamas, or they are the killers engaged by a terrorist leader like Netanyahu. Selective condemnation of terrorism exposes our government's hypocrisy, exposes us to global ridicule. Take another case. Take the case of Vladimir Putin's unilateral invasion of Ukraine, causing immeasurable loss of life and property of the ordinary Ukrainian people. It was clearly a terrorist act by a slew of criminals at the behest of Putin. But what was India's response? There was no condemnation of Putin. Our Prime Minister issued a blank statement. We want a negotiated settlement to the crisis. And that was hailed by the cheerleaders of our ruling dispensation as a middle path. If a middle path is our policy, we could have followed the same approach when it came to the current West Asian crisis. India could have expressed concern over the attack on the civilians in Israel, but in the same breath, India could have invoked the two-state formula which it had espoused for decades to resolve the Palestinian crisis. He could have said that there was a need for negotiated settlement to put an end to this cycle of violence and counter-violence, just as it had said when Putin's gang had bombarded the civilian settlements in Ukraine. But no. Our Prime Minister was quick only to condemn the Hamas. Not a word came out of his Twitter handle that there was a need for negotiated settlement. Just think of it. Was the devastation caused by Putin's monsters on the Ukrainian citizens that fateful February night last year any less severe than what Hamas did to the Israeli citizens last Saturday? No. Then why is our government dubbing only the Hamas as a terrorist but not Putin? Why is it that our Prime Minister is warmly embracing terrorist masterminds like Putin and Netanyahu but unilaterally condemns Hamas? Is that the signature diplomacy of a Vishwaguru? It's a question we should ponder over. Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads. This is a platform that discusses fiercely and fearlessly the threats to our democracy. We all are proud Indians, and it's our solemn duty to call out those rulers who diminish India's democratic credentials by their acts of omission and commission. In the last episode, we discussed the hypocrisy of our leadership in embracing one set of terrorists while condemning another. How our Prime Minister rightly condemned Hamas, the terrorists who rule over Gaza Strip in West Asia, but showed solidarity with another terrorist establishment, Netanyahu's Israel. Many cheerleaders of our ruling dispensation question us. Israel is a sovereign country. How can it be called terrorist? Well, Israel is a terrorist country in the same sense we call Pakistan a terrorist country. Just as Pakistani army harbors terrorists, trains them and sends them to kill civilians in India, Israeli army trains mercenaries and command them to kill innocent Palestinians with impunity. And it has been doing so for more than 7 decades. After all, Hamas had originated as a socio-religious outfit, just as our own RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, did. Hamas wanted to create an Islamic state in Palestine as opposed to a secular state conceived by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. Hamas's idea of Islamic state was just a replica of RSS idea of a Hindu Rashtra. In fact, Hamas was funded and nurtured by Israel, a country of Jews, as a counterweight to the secular and more militant PLO. Hamas's political Islam worked in tandem with Israel's political Zionism. But in the 1990s, Hamas turned into a terrorist outfit as a reaction to the naked terrorism perpetrated by Israel in a bid to destroy the Palestinian autonomy. In February 1994, Boris Goldstein, a Jewish settler trained by Israeli army, massacred in cold blood 29 Muslims at prayer in a mosque in Hebron in the West Bank during the month of Ramadan. The angry and grieving Palestinians demanded the withdrawal of the illegal Jewish settlement from the West Bank. The Israeli authorities refused to withdraw those Jews who were forcibly settled in West Bank by rolling out tanks against the Palestinian resistance. Those Jewish settlers were specifically trained by the Israeli army to engage in terrorist activities. When ordinary Palestinians rose in revolt to protest the killings by the Israeli terrorists, 19 more Palestinians were brutally massacred by Israeli bayonets. That is when Hamas swore to avenge the deaths. That's when Hamas turned into a terrorist outfit to counter the terrorism of Israel. But it has been an unequal fight. The Israeli terrorism has been backed by the powerful First World. But Hamas's counter-terrorism is promptly condemned by one and all, by the First World, of course. But even by India, a so-called third world country, which has maintained a studied silence while Israel has repeatedly indulged in terrorist activities in all these years. The terrorist attack by Hamas last Saturday has given the legitimate pretext to the Western world and the Western-backed terrorist state, Israel, to impose heavy costs in terms of death and destruction in Hamas-ruled Gaza Strip. It is this cycle of violence and counter-violence that has gripped the Israeli-Hamas relations in the last 3 decades. Mind you, this cycle of violence, the terrorist acts, began by the creation of the Western-backed Israel in the late 1940s. And that is started by Israelis themselves and the Western forces themselves. Let's be clear. Israel's creation and its existence is in no uncertain terms an illegitimate one. It's an illegitimate state. It is not just I am saying it, or a few people like me who are saying it. Our father of nation, Mahatma Gandhi, had said this in no uncertain terms. Mahatma had minced no words while saying so. It repeatedly. Gandhiji had worked with Jews in South Africa. He called them his dearest friends, his lifelong companions. Gandhiji had written eloquently what Jews had done to enrich world's literature, world's art, science, music, drama, medicine, agriculture, and whatnot. Mahatma Gandhi also had pained with anguish that Hitler's persecution of the Jews seemed to have no parallel in history. He wrote in November 1938, "The tyrants of the world never went so mad as Hitler seems to have gone." And this apostle of peace made the rarest of the rare statement in his life. If there ever could be a justifiable war in the name of and for humanity, a war against Germany to prevent the wanton persecution of Jews would be completely justified. Mind you, it's Gandhi saying this. But then Gandhi was an apostle of truth. He was no blind supporter of Jews. He was very clear. The persecution of Jews by Hitler does not give the right to Jews to persecute the Arabs. And Gandhi spoke brutally, frankly. Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France to the French. He was equally emphatic when he said, it would be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine could be given to the Jews partly or wholly as their national home. In July 1946, in the aftermath of brutal violence by the British Army to subjugate the protesting Arabs in Palestine, Gandhiji asked the Jews, why should you depend on American money and British arms to force yourself on an unwelcome land, Palestine? Subsequently, a series of terrorist acts executed by Jews themselves and masterminded by the British and the US forces against innocent Palestinians to force them to leave their homeland in order to give way for the creation of Israel, that stirred Gandhi's conscience. Gandhiji wrote, Jews have erred grievously by seeking to impose themselves on Palestine with the aid of America and Britain, and now with the aid of naked terrorism. Yes, Gandhi was forthright. The state of Israel was created by the naked terrorism of the Jews, aided and abetted by the Western forces. If a state was created by naked terrorism, those in control of that state are unvarnished terrorists. In this Gandhian perspective, Netanyahu is the gang leader of the bunch of terrorists controlling Israel and engaged in a war of attrition against Hamas, another terrorist outfit controlling Gaza. Yes, this is an equal fight between two terrorist outfits. One openly backed by the military might of the Western powers, and another only covertly supported militarily by a solitary Iran. In this unequal fight, the true followers of Gandhiji would condemn both the terrorist violence, the Hamas terror and the Israeli terror. Yes, Hamas began it this time. It must be condemned. But how many times our Prime Minister had condemned the repeated terrorist acts of Netanyahu's gang in the last 10 years that he has been in power? Both of them have been in power. Not even once. Only a fake follower of Gandhi will condemn terrorists of Hamas, but rub shoulders with the terrorists of Israel. Those who are genuine followers of Gandhi will condemn the terrorism of both Hamas and that of Israel. You viewers, decide for yourself whether you are a true follower of Mahatma Gandhi or a fake one. Welcome to another episode of the Democracy at the Crossroads. In the last episode, we discussed Mahatma Gandhi's strong views on the very existence of Israel. How this Jewish state was an illegitimate one. How it was created by naked terrorism resorted to by the Jewish mercenaries, aided and abetted by the English and the US imperialists. Gandhiji was enraged that the Israeli state came into existence by displacing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their motherland. If Gandhiji were alive today, he would mock at the hue and cry being raised by the very same terrorist Israel and its bloodthirsty backers UK and USA against the terrorism of Hamas, the Palestinian rulers of Gaza. It is distressing to see that even our Prime Minister has fallen into the Western trap. He has virtually mocked Mahatma Gandhi, the father of our nation, by promptly siding with the terrorist Israel to condemn the terrorist Hamas. Yes, Hamas needed to be condemned after the brutal attack against civilians on October 7. But then why hasn't our Prime Minister ever so openly sided with the terrorist Hamas to condemn the Israeli acts of terrorism? Take the case of a deadly bomb attack on a Gaza hospital last Tuesday, 17th October, leading to the death of almost 500 Palestinian men, women, and children. What did the Prime Minister say? 2 days after the ghastly incident, our Prime Minister opened his mouth, condoled the deaths in the Gaza hospital. But then, while condoling, why didn't our Prime Minister condemn the terrorists who brought about this devastation in a hospital? When Israelis die, you condemn. But when Palestinians die, you condole. Why this double standard, Mr. Prime Minister? All right. Who attacked Gaza hospital is now disputed. Arab countries accuse Israel of this war crime. Israel says Palestinian terrorists have done it. Although that sounds a very, very spacious explanation. Let's accept this for the time being. But then, there is no disputing the fact that Israeli terrorism has been showing its ugly face again and again over the last 6 decades. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister, is one of the ugliest masterminds of that Israeli terrorism. He has been responsible for the death of scores of Palestinians, innocent civilian Palestinians, during his tenure. According to BT Selim, a human rights watchdog, between 2006 and 2022, more than 4,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, have been killed by Israeli terrorists in Gaza Strip alone. Some of the biggest massacres of Palestinians have happened under the direct watch of Benjamin Netanyahu. It is not as if this killings of civilians has happened only in Hamas-ruled Gaza. Hamas they call terrorists. The Fatah-ruled West Bank has also been facing a similar tragic fate. More than 200 Palestinians have been killed this year itself in the West Bank. Mind you, 200 Palestinians have been killed in the last 9 months of 2023 itself in West Bank, where there is no Hamas. And who are the killers? The killers are Netanyahu's armed forces and the mercenaries trained by them. And this is not an allegation made by just the Palestinian Authority. It's a charge fully backed and authenticated by the UN Special Coordinator of Middle East, Thor Winsland. What did Winsland say? Mark his words. Unabated expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes, and attack by Israeli settlers on Palestinian villages, and overall operations by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank have resulted in the large number of these deaths in this year itself. Again, mind you, this is what the UN envoy for the Middle East has said, and not a Palestinian representative. Has our Prime Minister ever condemned this telltale Israeli violence, the terrorist acts of Netanyahu's mercenaries? No. Why no? Why does our Prime Minister promptly condemn Hamas's counter-terrorism, but is scared of calling out the repeated terrorist acts of Israel that has propelled hapless Palestinians for the counter-offensive? Why our Prime Minister doesn't squarely condemn when Palestinian blood is spilled, but he is unambiguous in his condemnation when Israeli blood spills? Is it that for a country like India, Palestinian blood is less precious than the Jewish blood? Is this moral hypocrisy due to our racial bias or religious bias? Or is it that it is ordained by our national interest, as our government would like us to believe? The father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who showed to the world India's high moral standing, would be ashamed of our current regime, which has turned India into a bootlicker of American imperialist design. My question to you, the citizens of India: what should we do to ensure that Gandhiji's soul rests in peace? I look forward to your candid response. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads. This time too, we'll discuss the Middle East crisis as we did in the last two episodes. We'll discuss how the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres stands tall among the array of world leaders, from Joe Biden of the US, Rishi Sunak of UK to Narendra Modi of Bharat, not to speak of a host of other Western leaders. Why does Antonio Guterres stand tall figuratively, in the company of these leaders? Because of what he said to the Security Council of the United Nations on Tuesday, which has got the goat of Israel. What did Guterres say on October 24? The Secretary General began his remarks by unequivocally condemning the horrifying 7th October act of terror by Hamas in Israel. He made a categorical assertion that hostages taken by Hamas must be freed immediately, safely, and without preconditions. After mentioning this, the Secretary General made the more pertinent point. He said, "It's important to also recognize that attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum." He elaborated it, saying that the Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They've seen their land steadily devoured by settlements, Jewish settlements, and plagued by violence, Jewish violence. Their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. This is the bitter truth which Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, and Narendra Modi and the like are afraid to speak up. They can only see the Hamas terror, but they are blind to the Zionist terror. Our gratitude to Antonio Guterres that he had the courage of conviction to call out both Hamas terror and Israeli terror. The Secretary General did not exonerate terrorist acts of Hamas as falsely charged by Israel. He was categorical that all the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas on October 7. But by the same token, the Secretary General also said the appalling attacks by Hamas cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people by Israel. The Secretary General mentioned how hundreds of civilians are dying in Gaza every day in the relentless bombing by Israel. How UN shelters have been destroyed, how 35 UN staffers have already been killed by the Israeli bombs in the last 17 days. What Biden's, Sunak's and Modi's do not dare to say to Israel, the Secretary General said it boldly and forthrightly. That Israel went against the international humanitarian law when it ordered 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, no fuel, and then asking them to go to south, then bomb the south itself. It's a clear violation of international law of war. Speaking this up front in a world forum needs courage. That courage of conviction differentiates a tall man from the puny men like Biden's, Sunak's and Modi's, who rightly express solidarity with Israel to condemn the Hamas terrorist act, but who refuse to open their lips against Chinese terrorist activities in the last 56 years and the same terrorist activities that are continuing in the last 18 days, as seen in the massacre of Palestinian civilians. Mr. Secretary, your bold utterances come as a breath of fresh air at a time when small-time leaders are shutting up to the Zionist terrorist establishment. You have called out both the evils, the evil of Hamas and the evil of an occupying force, Israel. The world bows before you, Your Excellency, for exposing the politics of appeasement practiced by these Western leaders and their minions around the world. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads. This is a platform where we discuss the threats to democracy worldwide, with special reference to India. It's a channel that discusses issues freely and fearlessly in the true spirit of freedom of expression. Please subscribe to this channel, watch it, and raise issues to keep democracy alive in India and the world. In this episode, we'll discuss Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan's strident comment on Israel-Hamas war, which has caused ripples in the Western world. President Erdogan told the lawmakers of his party in an open forum earlier this week that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. It's a Mujahideen group, it's a liberating force. It is working for the liberation of Palestinian people from the Israeli occupation of their homeland. Turkey's president made another scathing comment. Western tears about Israel are a manifestation of fraud. Erdogan called for an end to relentless Israeli bombardment of Gaza and cessation of all hostilities. Israel has reacted strongly to this Turkish president's remarks. Some Western leaders have also made caustic comments about the president of Turkey, a country which is not strictly speaking an Arab nation, but which has a significant minority of Arab descent. Remember, President Erdogan had condemned the Hamas attack on Israelis on October 7. But on October 25, he qualified his earlier statement that Hamas attack was a barbaric one, but that did not make Hamas a terrorist organization, he said. He would say in the same token that Israeli attacks on Gaza has been also barbaric, but that did not make Israel a terrorist organization. I would think President Erdogan is partly right and partly wrong. He is right that Hamas is striving for the liberation of the Palestinian people. But there is no disputing that what Hamas did on October 7 was a terrorist act. But then the way Western countries have dismissed Hamas as a terrorist organization is also wrong. India has refused to describe Hamas as a terrorist outfit. And that is a principled position for India. India is in line with Turkey on this issue. But India is out of sync with Turkey on the question of Israel. President Erdogan's comments on Israel is quite apt. He says that Israel is an occupying force. It's evident to all that Israel is an occupying force of the Palestinian Territory for the last 56 years. It's absolutely clear to anyone, one and all, that Israel came into existence by acts of Jewish terrorism, aided and abetted by English army and American dollars. Thus England and USA accomplished it in the terrorist plot that created Israel. It's manifest hypocrisy on the part of Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak and Benjamin Netanyahu to condemn Hamas terrorism but forget the terrorist legacies of their own countries. If terrorism has to be wiped out, yes, Hamas has to be eliminated. But then the very existence of Israel is also open to question. The state of Israel was created by repeated acts of terror. Israel must be wiped out from the Palestinian Territory to put an end to the original cause of terrorism in the Middle East. If Israel disappears, then counter-terrorism of Hamas will also disappear. So President Erdogan is both right and wrong. He is right that Hamas is a liberation force, but he is wrong not to accept that Hamas is a liberation force that resorts to terrorist acts to counter Jewish terrorism. Erdogan is right in that West and India's mollycoddling of Israel and their refusal to call out Israeli terrorism is a clear manifestation of fraud. If you agree with this point of view, please like this channel. If you disagree, please make your point. Let free discussion thrive. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads, a platform where we discuss threats to our democratic ideals openly and defiantly. This time, we'll discuss India's vote in the United Nations General Assembly on the Middle East crisis. I have no hesitation in saying that our government's decision to abstain from the United Nations resolution calling for humanitarian truce leading to cessation of hostilities in the Middle East shows how our proud independent nation is increasingly being turned into a lackey of the Jewish terrorist state. Look at the UN resolution proposed by Jordan and co-sponsored by 40 other countries. In order to ensure that there was a broader support for peace in the Middle East, the resolution steered clear of any adversarial reference to the oppressive occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel for last 56 years. There is no mention of the naked acts of Jewish terrorism against Palestinians leading to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. By the same token, to get larger support for the humanitarian cause, the resolution did not explicitly mention the terrorist acts of Hamas on October 7 or the Jewish terrorist revenge in the last 3 weeks. In a bid for truce, the UN resolution did mention that 1,400 civilians have died in the Hamas terrorist attack, but more than 8,000 Palestinians have died in the Israeli terrorist attack. To garner that consensus, the resolution did not emphasize the fact that the civilian casualty of the Israeli terrorist attack in last 3 weeks is almost 6 times that of Hamas terrorist attack on October 7. Without going into the specifics, the resolution titled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. The resolution condemned all acts of violence aimed at Palestinian and Israeli civilians, including all acts of terrorism and indiscriminate attacks, as well as all acts of provocation, incitement, and destruction. Was there anything for India to disagree with such a broad statement that sought to end the wanton bloodshed? But India, sucking up to terrorist Israel and imperialist USA, refused to endorse it. In its official explanation of vote, EOV, Indian representative at the UN said, India abstained on the resolution because it didn't include explicit condemnation of the October 7 terror attacks in Israel. Our blockheads in the External Affairs Ministry did not see that the resolution had also refrained from condemning the Jewish terrorist attack in Gaza Strip in the last 20 days. Has India become an one-eyed evil entity? Is there a secret compulsion for India to suck up to Israel, even as it made India isolated worldwide? Is it because our government is afraid that if it did not toe the Israeli line, then the terrorist state would stop supplying Pegasus accessories to those in office today to snoop over their adversaries? What could be the reason for India's monstrously dubious decision to abstain on a resolution which is seeking to end the terrible bloodbath that is killing thousands of innocent children? Narendra Modi's India should learn a bit of diplomacy from Emmanuel Macron's France. Macron, the French president, mind you, had condemned the Hamas terrorist attack in most unequivocal terms. In fact, President Macron had visited Tel Aviv after October 7 to express his country's full solidarity with Israel after the Hamas attack. He had said then that France was ready to join forces to counter all terrorist attacks on the innocent civilians. But again, mind you, same Macron's France voted for the UN resolution on October 27. Listen to France's explanation of its vote. It said, nothing can justify the suffering of civilians. All victims deserve our compassion. All lives are equal, and there is no hierarchy between them. What profound words. All lives are equal, and there is no hierarchy between them. Palestinian lives are no less precious than Jewish lives. How much Modi's India has to learn from Macron's France. India's foreign policy, which is being anchored by supposedly an ace diplomat, S. Jaishankar, should take some lessons from his French counterpart in diplomacy and advise his political boss to act in a way that enhances India's image as an independent nation standing up for human values and not diminish a proud nation like ours as a bootlicker of a terrorist state. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads, a platform where we speak truth to power. In this episode, we'll discuss Union Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar's shenanigans in the last week. As we know, the Kerala police has registered an FIR against the Union Minister for his provocative social media posts, blaming a minority community for the multiple blasts at a convention center in Kalamashri, Kerala. The minister was charged with disrupting the communal harmony in the state. He was accused of promoting enmity between different groups on grounds of religion. The BJP has, of course, vociferously protested against this police action, saying it is appeasement politics, appeasement of the minorities. But the party forgets that had someone made similar incendiary remarks against the majority community in a BJP-ruled state, he would have been promptly arrested, not just an FIR had been lodged against him. Is that because the ruling party at the center is pursuing a policy of majority appeasement? Maybe. Maybe the Kerala government ought to have followed the same template established by the BJP. Rajiv Chandrasekhar should have been locked up in jail for some time so that he understands that ours is a secular country and communal outbursts cannot be countenanced under any circumstances. Yes, both Chandrasekhar and his party have been creating a ruckus about an organization holding a pro-Palestine rally in Kerala, where a Hamas leader's a recorded message was played on a giant screen put up for the large audience. What is the objection of Chandrasekhar and company? They say that Hamas indulged in terrorist acts against Israelis on October 7. So inviting a leader of Hamas to address a gathering tantamounts to inciting terrorism. Well, the objection would have been valid had the Hamas leader incited the audience to resort to violence. But the available transcripts of the address suggest Hamas leader only talked about the prolonged fight of the Palestinian people to win back the freedom of their land from an occupying force, Israel. In fact, he just thanked all those who were expressing solidarity with the struggle of Palestinians. What is there to object to in this? Still, people may object. That may be the personal opinion of Rajiv Chandrasekhar or the organizational opinion of the BJP, and they are entitled to it in a democracy. But when they say that Kerala police ought to have intervened and not allowed the broadcast, that raises a disturbing question. Let's ask Rajiv Chandrasekhar, under what law is he saying that the Hamas leaders should not have been allowed to address the rally? Well, he may call Hamas a terrorist organization. He and his friends all can say. That may be their personal opinion. But Hamas has not been declared illegal by the government of India. Hamas does not become a terrorist organization just because Rajiv Chandrasekhar and sundry others in his party desire so. After all, their party is in power. Why don't they ask their supreme leaders, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister, to declare Hamas a terrorist organization? Once the government declares so, any organization inviting Hamas to speak will be liable for legal action. Yes? But before the Union government designates Hamas as a terrorist outfit, everyone is free to engage Hamas and its leaders in deliberations on the Middle East crisis. Let's remind the Union Minister and his cohorts. Just as Hamas indulged in terrorist acts in Israel on that one day, October 7, just a day, Benjamin Netanyahu's mercenaries have also been indulging in terrorist acts in Gaza for the last 26 days. They have done one day, these fellows are doing it for 26 days. If BJP still chooses to hold a pro-Israel rally and invites the terrorist mastermind Netanyahu to address that gathering, nobody would ask for police action against the BJP leaders for glorifying terrorism. Unless and until the Union government designates the State of Israel as a terrorist outfit. It's astonishing that Rajiv Chandrasekhar, a union minister, does not understand this basic distinction. If this is the state of a minister of a union government, how can you find fault with the riffraffs of the party who are ideologically brainwashed to rage the communal temperature in this country day in and day out. What do you have to say to them? Welcome to another episode of Democracy at the Crossroads, a platform where we speak truth to power. In this episode, we'll discuss how terrorists can be revolutionaries. This is in the context of the raging war in the Middle East. As you know, after 28 days of relentless bombing that has killed almost 10,000 children, women and civilian Palestinians in Gaza Strip, the Israeli Foreign Ministry says it's a war of self-defense after being attacked brutally by Hamas on October 7. The Israeli commander says, our goal is to eliminate Hamas control and Hamas terrorism from Gaza Strip. Yes. There is no denying that the October 7 attack by Hamas on Israelis was barbaric. By Israel's own declaration, 1,400 Israeli men, women and children died in that terrorist attack on October 7. More than 200 have been held hostage by Hamas. Israel says, yes, it is killing Palestinian women, men and children. Since October 7, more than 10,000 Palestinians have been killed by conservative estimate. But for Israel, that is not terrorism, that is self-defense. Then, by the same logic, what Hamas generals did on October 7 was also not terrorism, it was an act of self-defense. After all, they were seeking to defend Palestinians from repeated terrorist acts by the Israeli forces for decades, since 1950s in fact. In fact, Israel has also killed more than 800 Palestinians in cold blood in the last 2 years. 300 this year itself before October 7. So both Israel and Hamas are terrorist outfits. But there is a fundamental difference. Israel has a fully equipped defense force, IDF, backed to the hilt by the most powerful military in the world, the United States of America. So it can indulge in terrorist acts with impunity. And it has been doing so for days, months and years. If we have to document all the terrorist acts of Israel in the last 75 years, it will fill thousands of pages. In this scenario, Palestinians also have a right to self-defense. But Palestinian Authority, which rules over the West Bank, has succumbed to the Israeli pressure in exchange for money. The ruling Fatah has turned into a corrupt and servile outfit. It's slushed with Israeli money. No wonder it's carrying out the diktats of the Israeli government without a murmur. That leaves Palestinians to turn to Hamas to defend them, to defend their lives, to defend their territory. But Hamas has a ragtag army. It's no match for Israeli forces. In fact, the entire Arab world combined is no match to the brutal force that Israel enjoys, thanks to the big daddy USA. It's an irony that none of the Arab countries is ready to extend military support to Hamas for the fear of incurring the wrath of Israel. It's Iran, a non-Arab country, which has given some support to Hamas. That too, not openly. It's all covert support. In such a state, is Hamas in a position to declare open war on Israel to defend the Palestinian territory? Well, that would be a Gandhian option. Peaceful resistance. But then Gandhi was leading a freedom struggle against the British, who at least formally believed in the rule of law. They set up courts, created statutes. They were ready to go through the motions of a justice system, howsoever arbitrary that might have been. But Israel's armed mercenaries have no qualms about the processes, about the rules, penal codes. They just pick up guns and shoot. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have lost their lives in the last several decades, just by the trigger of an Israeli gun, on the whims of the occupying Israeli forces. Would the Gandhian solution have worked? Well, that's a debatable point. But Hamas didn't think so. After all, in India too, despite Gandhiji's strong moral leadership, we had a band of revolutionaries who thought that the only way to send shockwaves to the British administration was through terrorist attacks. There was Hindustan Republican Army. There was Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. There was Anushilan Samiti. There were Bhagat Singhs, Sukhdevs, Bhaga Jatins, Ram Prasad Bismils, and scores of others who thought Gandhian method was pure cowardice. They believed the path of non-violence would keep the British anchored to Indian territory to rule forever on all of us. For them, the real bravery lies in instilling the fear of life in the mind of the occupying Britishers ruling over us. They were ready to lay down their lives for the freedom of India. The Britishers and a large part of the world called these revolutionaries terrorists. But the entire country, including Mahatma Gandhi, called them true patriots. In fact, Gandhi wrote a moving tribute when Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev and Rajguru were hanged. What Hindustan Republican Army HRA was for Indians, Hamas is for the Palestinians. Hamas may be a terrorist organization for Israel and the larger world, but It's a revolutionary organization for the Palestinians. Just as Hindustan Republican Army engaged in terrorist strikes for the sake of freedom of India from the yoke of Great Britain, the Hamas's terrorist attacks have just one goal: the freedom of Palestine from the Israeli occupation. Both HRA and Hamas underline one truth: terrorists can be true revolutionaries. They are terrorists for some, but revolutionaries for others. Thank you. Welcome to the 28th episode of Democracy at the Crossroads, a platform where we speak truth to power. In today's program, we'll discuss a striking aspect of the freedom of the official media in the UK and the USA, two prominent liberal democracies of the world. Just look at this. Both United Kingdom and United States of America have declared Hamas, that rules over the Gaza Strip, as a terrorist organization. But both British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, Broadcaster of Great Britain, Public Broadcaster of Great Britain, and Voice of America, VOA, which is the tax-funded broadcaster of the United States of America, refused to designate Hamas as a terrorist organization. What defiance! What assertion of independence! The question we are asking is this: can our public broadcaster, Doordarshan, show a fraction of that independence in India? Let us discuss the issue in some detail. On October 7, Hamas launched a barbaric attack on the Israeli civilians that killed more than 1,400 men, women, and children. A large part of the world, including the UK and the US, condemned this October 7 attack by Hamas as a terrorist act. But both the BBC and the VOA have persisted with their policy. They refuse to call it a terrorist attack. They use the adjective militant instead of terrorist to describe the October 7 attack on Israelis by Hamas. Here let us just discuss the BBC for reasons of paucity of time. Is the state-first policy of the BBC not to describe any organization as terrorist, even if the British government has designated those organizations as terrorist outfits? And Hamas is no exception. This position of the BBC has caused a storm, a fierce backlash from the government. But the BBC has refused to budge from its stand. The BBC says, while Israeli government or British government, for that matter, describe Hamas as terrorist, the BBC has no problem in using the word terrorist while quoting those authorities. But the BBC's own reporter or the BBC host on our own will not use the word terrorist while describing the Hamas atrocities on Israeli civilians. Why so? The BBC is unfettered. While reporting on a conflict between two parties, it will refuse to describe one party as terrorist, and that would amount to taking sides in a conflicting situation. Journalists must not take sides, he said, while reporting any violence and counter-violence. It must present facts objectively, BBC says. The BBC reminds us that while reporting on brutal killings of Palestinians by Israelis in the last several decades, no BBC reporter has ever described Israeli action as a terrorist act. BBC asserts that it's a matter of journalistic integrity. It wants to live up to the high standard of objectivity it has set for itself. Its position will not change just because it is public funded and the British government stands with Israel and condemns Hamas as a terrorist outfit. How has the British government responded to this? An enraged British Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, has reacted sharply to this BBC position. He says, I actually think it is verging on disgraceful, this idea that there is some sort of equivalence, the equivalence between Hamas attack and Israeli attack. Shapps goes on to say, Hamas has been declared a proscribed, a terrorist organization in the UK. They are not freedom fighters. They are not militants. They are pure and simple terrorists. But it's remarkable to go to the BBC website and still see them, BBC people, talking about gunmen and militants and not calling them terrorists. But mind you, after saying this, the British Defence Secretary doesn't threaten to disrupt the taxpayer funding of the BBC. He, along with the Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser, all of them urge BBC to revise its policy. Even the leader of the opposition in Great Britain, Labour leader Keir Starmer, says he sees Hamas as a terrorist outfit. But even he doesn't threaten that he will squeeze BBC funding when the Labour comes to power. He just wants BBC to explain what he calls the public broadcaster's unfortunate decision not to call Hamas a terrorist organization. The BBC's Director of Editorial Policy and Standards, David Jordan's response is quite forthright. He says the BBC's job is to place the facts before its audience, to enable the audience to make their own assessments about who is doing what to whom. And it says it's ready to face consequences for standing up to its position. I consider BBC a true torchbearer of editorial standard. And it deserves a salute that it's defying the authorities, its own government, to uphold its journalistic principle. What is indeed striking is that BBC, a public broadcaster, is thriving and going strong. It's enjoying enormous credibility despite refusing to toe the government line. Imagine our Doordarshan, our own public broadcaster, refusing to describe Hamas attack as terrorist, even after our Prime Minister has openly sided with Israel against Hamas terrorism. Will poor Doordarshan survive even for a day? We Indians should ponder over this question if we are concerned about our democracy.